Now, you wanted to talk about garments and rendering, didn't you?
Yeah, they that seems to come up all the time of rending of garments, and I just had to look it up, and then I went down one of my rabbit holes on rending. And I was shocked at how many times that this idea of rending your garments or tearing, and I looked at a bunch of through our dear friend Bible Gateway of rending, and it seems like the more of the new translations don't translate it as rending; they'll
Oh,
translate it as tearing of garments. Like the New International Version
yeah,
translates it as tearing, as at least in the New Testament context. Like in Mark 14:16, I think that was the King James Version said that the curtain of the temple was rent.
yeah.
And in the New King James Version, which it was, I think that came out in the 1980s, the early 1980s translation, they say tear, or that it was torn. And I think Matthew 26:65 might be a pericope of 1463. I didn't look that up exactly, but I'm thinking that they were that was the Matthew part where they talk about that the shroud of the temple was rent when the Jesus right when Jesus dies, when everything, I think that's the part, at least when the temple,
The
all sorts
curtain.
of bad stuff started happening. And then there was something in Acts 14:14, which was inconsequential to anything, but they just used that term rending of your garments. And that's really all of that. In modern Jewish practice, there's a symbolic, oh, I believe in the one in the Matthew, they used it when Jesus is in front of the Sanhedrin and he says something, and the high priest's so upset he rends his garment. Uh, in modern Jewish practice, it's a symbolic action of showing extreme upsetness during a funeral, and the during a certain part of the funerary rituals, they'll take a symbolic piece of cloth and tear it or cut it, and then they pin it to their clothing. And there's even a in some practices where at a funeral, the the people who aren't the immediate family will separate into two groups as kind of like a ritual tearing or separating, and it's really just to show like an extreme upsetness in the modern day of somebody being dead, a family member. And there's a Hebrew name. I know I'm going to butcher this. It's Karia, and it's spelled in different ways where the K and the R are together, and you assume there's a vowel in there. But I won't go any further than that. But our Jewish listeners can definitely write in and correct my pronunciation of that. But that word rend, and you would think, because we use the word rend at least fairly commonly, like if a recipe might say like render bacon,
Yeah.
and that means like melt it down, and it doesn't really have a tearing or breaking aspect to it. And it doesn't, because rend, as they used it in the King James Version, is a completely different word than rend or render in the case of rendering bacon, or like rendering beef fat or something like that. And actually, our word rent, it can be used like in the Bible. They said somebody rent their garments, using rend in the past tense, and rent in that condition is from a completely different root than rent, like our rent, like you pay rent for a building you don't actually own, you're just paying for it. Um, the rend, as in tearing your garment, comes from an Old English Anglo-Saxon word, which ultimately is Germanic, which means more or less to tear. And that comes through in a couple other Germanic languages. Dutch has something similar. Um, High German has a something of a similar word. Uh, but then that word like rent and render, that comes from a Latin word, ren and then dere, which means to basically means something to give back. So two completely different words. So you can kind of see why modern translations, short story long, why they kind of steer away from using rend anymore and rent his garments, because it does give a very different idea to a word that it doesn't mean. It just means tear. And that's another wonderful King James version word that probably should be changed. But a lot of the King James people think that King James version is an inerrant document.
Yeah, I find them very annoying. I mean, when I was doing my podcast, I researched the history, of the King James translation, and they used various editions of Erasmus and Theodore Beza and something. And it's manifestly obvious that the King James Bible was assembled out of a big toolkit of parts. Now, how would it be possible to think that it's inerrant, given that it was obviously put together by pretty smart people, but from different bits? I mean, it was God saying, okay, now for this verse, go from Erasmus first edition, use that bit. Next verse from Theodore Beza, and next verse from a Bible called with the wonderful name of the Complutensian Polyglot.
Plus, the King James version, they had some people who knew Greek, and they knew Greek pretty well.
Mm.
But pretty well is a subjective term. They didn't have Greeks. And in a lot of cases, those people who knew Greek didn't even learn their Greek from actual Greeks. So they're kind of patching it all together from Latin and to make it make sense in their version of English, which
Mm.
has changed a bit since our version of English. And, maybe the person who was cracking that open in the late 1500s, if they read something like render unto Caesar, and that render made a lot of sense to them as just give, and then rent his garments and it was just tear, maybe that shade of difference made a lot of was linguistically and semantically clear to them, but obviously that difference is not clear to us today.
Yeah. So I was wondering, the notion that a particular translation is inerrant, like the King James, is that a purely Anglo-Saxon phenomenon, or do, for example, German speakers have a translation which they regard as inerrant, or the French or the Italians?
Yeah, that's interesting. I don't know about that. It seems to me like that might be something more of a Protestant
Yeah.
thing to me, that if you're putting that much weight on the Bible and personal reading, you
Mm.
want a document that's accurate to the letter, really, or you have to at least have faith in it that it's completely accurate. Where up until the Middle Ages, before printing, your average person sitting in church probably had never even seen a Bible, and they probably couldn't have read it either because would have been in Latin or Greek, depending on where they were. So that whether the Bible was inerrant or not probably didn't mean a whole hill of beans to them.
That's a good point. And there would have been many differences, yeah, between the actual copies that the people had. Yeah, the whole notion of inerrancy must be a fairly recent one. Actually, when did the notion that the King James Bible was inerrant arise? 1700s, 1800s?
That would be my guess.
Yeah.
I mean, there's people today who would say that the King James Bible would go over like the Vulgate.
Mm.
And, so obviously that's maybe an outlier, but, there are people out there today who put a lot of weight on the King James version, maybe even as it lends itself authority, if you will, because it uses these and thous and old-fashioned language, old-timey language.
So, how does the New King James differ from the King James? What are the big differences?
The And from what I've read about the New King James Version, it tries to keep kind of the poetic version and the poetic flow of the King James Version, but iron out some of the things that are either anachronistic or that the King James Version maybe didn't get quite right, and maybe just dress it up a little bit more.
Okay. Okay. So they keep the same old-fashioned verbs and words like dost and all that sort of stuff, do you think? Or?
It's not, it doesn't, they might use the and that sort of thing, but they tame it way down. It's not 100 proof King James version. It's been proofed down to about 40% King James.
Okay. And they'll probably keep all the these and thous in the most famous passages, which is like, thou shalt not kill,
Yeah.
that sort of thing.
And it, like I said, it is a fairly new translation. I think it's early 80s, and they have
Oh, okay.
it's called the Word of Promise Bible, and that was done in maybe, I think, the early 2000s, and that's what I'll often listen to for preparing for episodes like this. And it's all famous actors who act out the different passages, like Jim Caviezel, who's obviously Jesus from the Passion of the Christ. He does Jesus in the New King James version of the Word of Promise, and it's an app and Audible. You can get it for 1 credit. Who else does? Ernie Hudson from the Ghostbusters. He does. I think he's St. Peter, which he does a really good job.
So these are little playlets or something, are they?
Yeah, they read it word for word.
Oh, okay.
The parts of the Bible translation where it's just a narrator and they can't put it to one specific person. Michael York is the narrator of Austin Powers fame. I think he's
Yeah.
probably but he's been in like a million other movies. He's the poor man's Michael Caine.
Yeah, he is, isn't he? He's had a bit of an odd career. From what I remember, his most interesting films were done when he was quite young, which would be what, back in the 60s,
Yeah.
maybe early 70s.
What was his? He did.
And he never quite made it to the A grade, did he?
No, he was kind of a bit person in a lot of movies.
I know he was in some really quirky ones. There was one film, oh, geez. The daughter of someone is trying to kill her mother, who's Angela Lansbury. Michael York is the chauffeur, and he blackmails the daughter or something.
He was in the movie I probably liked him the best in was Logan's Run. That
Oh,
was
yeah.
sort of a dystopian sci-fi movie from, I want to, it was probably the early 70s, maybe late 60s.
I quite liked him in Austin Powers because he seemed like he was having fun.
Yeah. It looks like he may have done a lot of British TV too.
How old is he now?
Television. 78.
Oh, okay. I always imagined him as young. Yeah, because Logan's young. Run.
Yeah.
He would
And
be in his 30s or something.
he's done he hasn't done a ton. He did some voice work, it looks like, according to his IMDb, in the last maybe 20 years going on now, but
Yeah.
not a lot of actual on film roles. Oh, wasn't he in an old, maybe a 70s version of the Three Musketeers?
That's right, he was too. They made 2 films. He was D'Artagnan, I think.
Yeah, he's really good. But I think maybe he was too much like Oh my goodness.
Michael Caine.
Michael, okay.
Yeah, yeah.
Because he even sometimes wore those big glasses too.
Oh, okay. Yeah, Michael Caine must be getting on, mustn't he?
All right, we've got to look up that now. I'm gonna guess. I'm gonna give him over under. I think he's a little older.
Okay. I once heard Michael Caine say that when he's given a script, he looks to see if his character is on the first page of the script and the last page. If he is, he takes the movie. He's not very
Oh,
he's not very discriminating.
he's actually quite a bit older. He's
Okay.
87.
He's 87. Oh, okay. Gee, last I saw him on some talk show, which would be a couple of years ago, he didn't look 87.
If you look at his Wikipedia page, he looks 87.
Oh, does he now? What was his last film
Well,
or most recent film?
let's see. He was in a Woody Allen movie that was really good. Oh,
Ah,
he's been in. Oh man, the Twist, which hasn't even been released yet.
he's still
Um,
going.
yeah.
See, I told you, the man will do anything for money.